The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt safe, until it wasn't. For Tracy Bendel, the end of her normal life didn't begin with a bang, but with a terrifying, hollow thud. It was the sound of her foot hitting the floorboard, a brake pedal offering zero resistance. For a heartbeat, there was only the sickening silence of realization. Then, the world exploded. The high-pitched scream of carbon fiber tearing against asphalt ripped through the neighborhood air as her faded compact car plowed into the rear of a blacked-out armored convoy. The impact was violent, a shuddering vibration that rattled Tracy's teeth and filled the cabin with the scent of ozone and disaster. But it was the sound that followed that truly signaled her ruin. The low, predatory roar of a Bugatti tourbillon as the $4 million machine was forced to a dead, crumpled stop. In that single, visceral moment, the quiet morning was gone, replaced by a debt that no amount of prayer could ever repay. Hello, my incredible viewers. You're welcome. If you're the kind of person who craves stories that feel real, raw, and keep you glued till the end with an unforgettable memory, then you're in the right place. Hit that like button. It's the fuel that keeps the storytelling engine running. But before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new around here, hit the subscribe button to catch every single story we share. Now, let's dive into it.
The smoke rising from the Bugatti's mangled rear didn't smell like a regular car fire. It smelled like burnt wealth, expensive leather, high-grade carbon fiber, and a $4 million dream evaporating into the city air. Tracy sat behind her steering wheel, frozen. The airbag had deployed like a punch to the gut, leaving her gasping for air that was thick with the scent of ozone and disaster. Through the hazy, spider-webbed cracks of her windshield, she watched the world outside descend into a terrifying, synchronized ballet of power. Black SUVs, the armored guards of the convoy, swerved into a perimeter, blocking off the intersection with military precision. Men in razor-sharp suits emerged from the vehicles, their movements clinical and cold. They didn't look like drivers, they looked like soldiers. Tracy's mind raced with the terrifying math of her reality. She was a woman who lived by a spreadsheet of coupons and late notices. She had been on her way to the community center to beg the bank for a 3-day extension on the utility bill. Now she was looking at a repair bill that could buy her entire neighborhood twice over. Then the door of the Bugatti tourbillon hissed open. Tracy expected a monster. She expected a man who would scream, who would drag her out of her seat, or at the very least look at her with the white-hot rage of someone whose prized possession had just been desecrated. Instead, the man who stepped out into the swirling smoke was a vision of absolute, terrifying stillness. Park Jin-woo didn't look at the shattered taillights or the crumpled hood of his hypercar. He adjusted the set of his dark-tailored blazer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were stepping onto a red carpet rather than a crash site. He was tall, his presence dominating the asphalt, his features carved with a cold, aristocratic precision that made Tracy's survival instinct scream. He walked toward her car. Every footfall felt like a judge's gavel. Tracy forced her door open, her legs shaking so violently she nearly collapsed onto the wet pavement. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice thin and cracking. "The brakes, they just went. I'll call my insurance. Jin-woo stopped just inches from her. He didn't look at her insurance card. He didn't look at her dented bumper. He looked directly into her eyes, his expression unreadable, calculating. There was no anger in his gaze, which was the most frightening part of all. It was the look of a predator who had just seen something much more interesting than a broken toy. "Insurance?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried the weight of absolute authority. He glanced at her faded hoodie, and the exhaustion etched into her face. "You make $40,000 a year, Miss Bendel. Your insurance wouldn't cover the paint on my door handle." Tracy froze. Her heart skipped a beat, then doubled its pace. "How do you know my name?" Jin-Woo leaned in slightly, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain clinging to him. He reached out, not to strike her, but to gently tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear with a gloved hand. The gesture was intimate and deeply unsettling. "The car is a machine," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a chill down her spine. "Machines can be replaced, but a woman with your reputation for persistence is much harder to find. I think we should discuss how you're going to work off this $4 million mistake." He wasn't calling the police, he was claiming her. And in that moment, as the sirens finally wailed in the distance, Tracy realized the crash wasn't the disaster, it was the trap. He stood there, arms now crossed over his chest, looking down at her not as a victim of an accident, but as a master who had finally caught a long-tracked prize. The smoke cleared, but the fog of fear in Tracy's mind only thickened. He didn't want her money, he wanted her, and that was a debt that would cost her far more than any bank account could ever hold. The transition from the cold, rain-slicked pavement to the silent, suffocating luxury of the Park Tower was so seamless it felt like a fever dream. Tracy didn't go to the police station, and she didn't go home to her cramped apartment to cry. Instead, she was ushered into the back of a blacked-out SUV that smelled of expensive leather and air filtration systems, driven by a man who hadn't spoken a single word since he closed her door. When the elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, the air was so thin and quiet she could hear the frantic rhythm of her own pulse. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and steel, perched so high above the city that the cars below looked like slow-moving embers. Everything was gray, silver, or deep obsidian. It was a space designed to make a person feel small, and as Tracy stood in the center of the vast living area, her faded hoodie and mud-stained sneakers felt like a desecration of the pristine marble floors. Park Jin-Woo was standing by a window that spanned the entire north wall, his back to her. He had shed his blazer, and the silk of his white dress shirt strained slightly against his broad shoulders as he poured amber liquid into a crystal glass. The ice clinked, a sharp, lonely sound in the cavernous room. $4,800,000, Jin-Woo said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room without him needing to turn around. That is the current valuation of the tourbillon you rendered undrivable, Tracy. It was only a 5 in this color profile. It cannot be repaired by a local mechanic, Tracy. It has to be shipped back to Molsheim, France. Tracy swallowed hard, her throat feeling like it was lined with glass. "I know what I did. I know I can't pay you, but taking me here, keeping me here, this isn't how the law works." Jin-Woo turned then, and the light from the city skyline caught the sharp angles of his face, casting half of it in shadow. He looked less like a businessman and more like a king deciding the fate of a peasant. He walked toward a heavy obsidian desk and picked up a single sheet of cream-colored paper. It wasn't a legal document, it was a work of art, embossed with a gold seal she didn't recognize. "The law is for people who have something to lose," he said, rounding the desk and stopping just a few feet from her. He held out the paper. "You have nothing. Your community center is 48 hours from a foreclosure auction. Your personal bank account has exactly $84 in it. You are a woman who spends her life saving people who don't have the power to save themselves. But today, Tracy, nobody is coming to save you." Tracy reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the paper. It was a contract, but the terms were unlike anything she had ever seen. There were no interest rates, no payment schedules, and no mention of banks. Instead, it listed a series of consultations. It demanded her presence at his side for the next 6 months. It demanded her moral perspective on his upcoming corporate acquisitions. In exchange, the debt for the Bugatti would be wiped clean, and a donation would be made to the Bendel Community Center, enough to clear their debts for a decade. "You want me to be your conscience?" Tracy whispered, looking up at him in disbelief. You're who everyone says you are. You don't have a conscience." "Precisely," Jinwoo replied, stepping closer, invading her personal space until she could feel the heat radiating from him. "My public image is currently problematic. I am acquiring a series of logistics firms that the city council is hesitant to approve. They see a mob boss. They need to see a philanthropist. They need to see a man who listens to someone like you." "This is a lie," she snapped, the fire of her advocacy finally flickering to life through her fear. "You're using me as a shield. You crashed my car. You sabotaged my brakes just to get me into this room, didn't you?" Jinwoo's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, a flash of something that looked like respect crossing his features. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. He simply gestured to the gold pen resting on the desk. "The Bugatti was a high price to pay for an introduction, I'll admit, but I find that people only listen when the stakes are absolute. Sign the contract, Tracy. Save your center. Save your people. All it costs is 6 months of your life spent in my world." Tracy looked at the pen, then at the man who had systematically dismantled her life in the span of an hour. He was offering her everything she had been praying for, but he was holding it behind a cage of gold bars. She knew that if she signed, she wasn't just paying off a car, she was selling her soul to a man who viewed people as assets to be managed.
But then she thought of the kids at the center. She thought of the elderly neighbors who relied on their food pantry. She thought of the closed sign that would be hung on the front door in 2 days if she walked out of this penthouse. With a jagged breath, Tracy picked up the pen. The weight of it felt like lead in her hand. She scribbled her name at the bottom of the cream-colored paper, the ink appearing black and permanent against the gold seal. Jinwoo took the paper from her the moment she finished. He didn't smile, but there was a predatory satisfaction in the way he folded the contract. "Welcome to the Convoy, Miss Bendel," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, silken register. "Your first meeting is at 6 a.m. Wear something expensive. My tailor is already in the guest suite waiting for you." As he walked away, leaving her standing alone in the vast, cold glass tower, Tracy realized she hadn't just settled a debt. She had entered a war, and her only weapon was a morality that her new master intended to use as a weapon of his own. The sun had not yet breached the city skyline when Tracy found herself standing before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, staring at a woman she didn't recognize. The tailor Jinwoo had provided moved like a shadow, pinning and tucking a charcoal-gray power suit that cost more than Tracy's annual salary. The fabric was silk wool, so fine it felt like a second skin, yet it felt like a suit of armor, heavy with the weight of her new reality. Her reflection showed a woman who looked capable, formidable, and utterly terrified. By 6 a.m., she was back in the belly of the beast, the rear seat of a blacked-out SUV. But this time, she wasn't alone. Park Jin-woo sat beside her, his attention focused on a tablet displaying scrolling streams of data and architectural renderings. He didn't look up as she slid in, but his voice was a low vibration in the small space. "The suit suits you, Miss Bendel. It projects the one thing you'll need today, belonging." "I don't belong here," Tracy whispered, clutching her modest briefcase, the only thing she had refused to replace. "I'm a social worker, not a corporate mascot." "Today, you are the conscience of the Park Group," Jinwoo countered, finally turning his gaze toward her. His eyes were sharp, scanning her face for any sign of weakness. "We are meeting with the District 7 Council. They are currently blocking my acquisition of the waterfront shipping yards. They believe my presence will corrupt the community. You were there to convince them otherwise." The convoy arrived at a nondescript, high-security office building near the docks. As they stepped out, the air changed. It was salty, industrial, and thick with the tension of a neighborhood on the brink of being swallowed by progress. Tracy saw the faces of the dock workers and the small business owners watching from across the street. These were her people. She could see the same look in their eyes that she saw in her mirror every morning, the fear of being erased. The boardroom was a theater of war. 5 council members sat behind a long oak table, their faces set in grim masks of skepticism. Jinwoo's legal team flanked him like a phalanx of polished steel, but he placed Tracy directly to his right. He didn't introduce his lead counsel first. He introduced her. "This is Tracy Bendel," Jinwoo announced to the room. The silence was absolute. "She is the director of the Bendel Community Center. She has spent 10 years fighting the very poverty you claim to be worried about. I have brought her here because I have no intention of building a fortress. I intend to build an ecosystem, and Ms. Bendel will be the one holding the keys." Tracy felt the heat of 10 pairs of eyes on her. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the council, then at Jinwoo. He was using her, yes, but as she looked at the maps on the table, she saw something she hadn't expected. The plans for the shipping yards included a vocational training center. They included subsidized childcare for the workers. They included the very things she had spent years begging the city for. "Is this true, Tracy?" one of the councilwomen asked, her voice softened by genuine confusion. "You're working for him?" Tracy looked at the gold-embossed contract in her mind, the debt of the Bugatti, and the faces of the children at her center who would have nowhere to go if she failed. She realized that Jinwoo was offering her a devil's bargain, but the devil was offering her the tools to save her world. "Mr. Park and I have a complex arrangement," Tracy began, her voice gaining strength with every word. She stopped leaning back and leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. "But I didn't come here to be a mascot. I'm here because if this project moves forward, I'm the one who will be drafting the community benefits agreement. If a single family is displaced without a relocation plan, I stop the machines. If the vocational center isn't built first, the project doesn't start." She looked at Jinwoo, expecting a flicker of annoyance or a warning glare. Instead, his expression was one of dark, quiet satisfaction. He leaned back, ceding the floor to her entirely. "I'm not here because I trust the Park Group," Tracy continued, her eyes locking with the councilwoman's. "I'm here because I trust that I can hold them accountable, and right now the shipping yards are a graveyard of lost potential. We can either keep them that way, or we can take this man's money and use it to rebuild our neighborhood." For the next 3 hours, Tracy didn't just speak, she fought. She dismantled the council's excuses and redrew Jinwoo's maps to favor the residents. Every time a lawyer tried to interrupt, Jinwoo raised a single hand, silencing them instantly. He watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Not the look of a boss, but the look of a man watching a storm he had intentionally summoned. By the time they walked back to the convoy, the council was shaken, their opposition crumbling under the weight of Tracy's local credibility. As the SUV pulled away, Tracy felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her. She slumped into the leather seat, the adrenaline fading into a dull ache.
You were more effective than my entire legal department, Jinwoo said, his voice unusually soft. I was honest, Tracy snapped, turning to face him. Don't mistake my advocacy for loyalty, Jinwoo. I'm doing this for them, not for you.
Jinwoo reached into the small refrigerator in the console and pulled out a bottle of water, handing it to her. His fingers brushed hers, a brief electric contact that she pulled away from instantly. I don't need loyalty, Tracy. Loyalty is bought and sold every day in this city, he said, his eyes fixed on the window as the industrial docks faded into the background. I need someone who isn't afraid to slap my hand when I reach for too much. You did exactly what I wanted. You gave me a soul. Is that all I am to you? A PR strategy? Jinwoo turned to her then, and for a split second the mask of the cold syndicate boss slipped. There was a loneliness in his eyes, a depth of calculation that went beyond business. I crashed a $4 million car just to hear you tell me I was wrong, Tracy. Do you really think I'd go through all that just for a city council vote? The car grew quiet, the tension between them thick enough to touch. Tracy looked away, her heart racing for an entirely different reason. She was beginning to realize that the work Jinwoo had for her wasn't just about shipping yards or corporate images. He was bringing her into his world to see if her light could survive his darkness, or if his darkness would eventually swallow her whole. We have a dinner tonight with the heads of the 5 families, he said, the mask sliding back into place as his tablet chimed with a new notification. They've heard about my new conscience. They want to see if you are real. Tracy looked at her hands, still shaking in her lap. The first day was over, but the war had only begun. She had saved her center, but as she watched the city lights begin to glitter like cold diamonds, she wondered if she was losing herself in the process.
The restaurant was a place that didn't exist on any public map. It was tucked behind an unmarked iron door in a narrow alleyway, a subterranean sanctuary of dark mahogany and deep crimson silk. The air was heavy with the scent of aged tobacco, expensive cognac, and an underlying current of cold, sharpened steel. As Tracy walked down the velvet-lined stairs, she felt the eyes of the underworld before she even saw their faces. Jinwoo didn't offer his arm, but he walked close enough that his presence acted as a physical barrier between her and the shadows. He had changed into a black-on-black suit that made him look less like a businessman and more like a reaper. Tracy, in the deep emerald silk gown his tailor had delivered only hours before, felt like a vibrant living thing being led into a tomb. At the center of the room sat a circular table. 4 men and 1 woman, the architects of the city's illicit foundations, sat in silence. These were the heads of the 5 families, the people who controlled the docks, the shadows, and the politicians. As Jinwoo approached, they didn't rise, but the tension in the room ratcheted up until it was a physical weight. Jinwoo, the oldest man said, his voice like gravel grinding together. He was Victor Vane, a man whose family had run the port for 3 generations. His eyes, milky with age, but sharp with malice, settled on Tracy. You've brought a guest to a blood table. That is a breach of tradition. The tradition is that we bring our most valued assets, Jinwoo replied, pulling out a chair for Tracy with a grace that felt like a threat. And Miss Bendel is the most valuable asset I possess. She has done in 1 afternoon what your lawyers couldn't do in a decade. She secured the District 7 Council. A low murmur rippled through the table. The woman, a sharp-featured figure known only as Madame Cho, leaned forward, the diamonds at her throat catching the candlelight. We also heard she's a social worker, a saint from the slums. Tell me, dear, how does it feel to trade your halo for a seat at this table? What was your price? Tracy felt the familiar sting of judgment, but this time it wasn't from a bank teller or a city official. It was from a shark. She took a slow breath, forcing her hands to remain still on the white linen tablecloth. "My price was the survival of people you've spent 40 years stepping on," Tracy said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm not here because I want your approval, Madam Cho. I'm here because Mr. Park understands something you don't. Power isn't just about who you can kill. It's about who you can convince to let you exist." The silence that followed was deafening. One of the men at the far end of the table scoffed, reaching for a steak knife. "Jinwoo, your pet has a bite, but let's be real. You brought her here to soften us, to make us think you're going legit so you can swallow our territories while we're busy looking at her pretty face."
"I brought her here so you could see the future," Jinwoo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register. He picked up his wineglass, the red liquid swirling like a dark omen. "The old ways are dying. The city is changing. If we don't have a face that the public trusts, we will be hunted to extinction. Tracy Bendel is that face. She is the bridge." "And what happens when the bridge breaks?" Victor Vane asked, his eyes never leaving Tracy's. "What happens when she realizes that the donations you're making to her center are washed in the blood of the people she tries to save?" Tracy felt a cold shiver trace its way down her spine. She looked at Jinwoo, searching for a denial, but he remained a statue of calm. He didn't lie to her, not here. The brutal honesty of the table was his only currency. "She already knows," Jinwoo said simply. "She's a social worker. She sees the blood in the streets every day. The difference is, I'm the only one offering to help her clean it up." The dinner arrived, courses of Wagyu beef and rare truffles that tasted like ash in Tracy's mouth. For 2 hours, she sat in the crossfire of veiled threats and power plays. She watched how Jinwoo navigated the room, how he used her presence as a shield and a distraction, parrying their questions with her successes. He was a master of the game, and she was the highest card in his hand. But as the night wore on, Tracy noticed something. Jinwoo wasn't just defending her, he was watching her reaction to them. Every time Victor Vane made a crude comment or Madame Cho suggested a violent solution to a logistics problem, Jinwoo's eyes would flick to Tracy, measuring her disgust, her resilience, her fire. When the check was finally signed in blood and ink, and they stepped back out into the cool night air of the alleyway, Tracy felt like she had aged a decade. The convoy was waiting, engines idling like purring beasts. "You didn't eat," Jinwoo noted as the door closed, sealing them back into their private leather-scented world. "I don't have much of an appetite for vultures," Tracy snapped, leaning her head against the cool glass of the window. "They're right, aren't they? I'm just a coat of white paint on a crumbling, blood-stained wall." Jinwoo reached out, his hand hovering over hers for a second before he pulled back, as if remembering a boundary he wasn't yet ready to cross. "You are the only thing in that room that wasn't for sale, Tracy. That's why they hate you, and that's why I need you." "Is that why you brought me? To prove you could own something that wasn't for sale?"
Jinwoo looked at her, the passing streetlights casting rhythmic flashes of amber across his face. "I don't want to own you, Tracy. I want to see if someone like you can survive someone like me." He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper above the hum of the tires. "Because if you can survive me, then maybe there's hope for me yet." Tracy looked at him, the dangerous, powerful man who had destroyed her car and saved her life in the same breath. For the first time, she didn't see a boss or a monster. She saw a man who was drowning in his own empire, reaching for her as if she were a life raft. And as she looked down at the emerald silk of her dress, she realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't just his conscience, she was becoming his obsession. Tomorrow, Jinwoo said, shifting back into his seat as his phone vibrated with a message from his security detail. "We go to your community center. It's time I met the people you're so desperate to protect." Tracy's heart skipped a beat. Bringing him to the center was a risk she wasn't sure she was ready to take. "They won't like you," she warned. "I'm not going there to be liked," Jinwoo replied, his eyes turning back to the dark window. "I'm going there to see what I bought for $4 million. The morning air at the Bendel Community Center was thick with the scent of cheap floor wax and the brewing industrial coffee that Tracy had relied on for years. But today, the atmosphere was fractured. Outside, the black SUVs of Jinwoo's Convoy sat idling like predatory beasts, their tinted windows reflecting the crumbling brickwork of the neighborhood. Inside, the children and elderly residents moved with a hushed, nervous energy, their eyes darting toward the man in the charcoal suit who stood in the middle of the gymnasium as if he were inspecting a conquered territory. Jinwoo didn't belong in a place where the basketball hoops were missing nets and the radiators hissed with metallic exhaustion. Yet he moved through the halls with a silent, observant grace. He watched Tracy interact with a group of teenagers, saw the way her face transformed from the hardened mask of the syndicate liaison back into the warm, fierce advocate who had first caught his attention. He saw her value here, not as a public relations tool, but as the beating heart of a community that refused to die. As the afternoon light faded, Tracy found herself in the center's small, cluttered tech lab. She was attempting to pull up the center's digital records for Jinwoo's accountants, but her old laptop was sluggish, its cooling fan whirring like a dying bird. Jinwoo entered the room, his presence making the cramped space feel even smaller.
"Your infrastructure is a liability," he remarked, his eyes scanning the outdated monitors and tangled wires. "I'll have my technicians replace all of this by Monday." "We don't need charity, Jinwoo. We need stability," Tracy replied without looking up. "And I don't need your technicians digging through our files." "They wouldn't be looking for your files, Tracy. They'd be looking for the ghost." She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "What ghost?" Jinwoo stepped closer, his shadow falling over her desk. "The reason your brakes failed. My security team recovered the telemetry data from your car's onboard computer yesterday. It's a simple system, easy to overlook, but they found a localized electromagnetic pulse signature that originated from within 50 yards of your vehicle 3 seconds before the impact." Tracy felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She turned her chair to face him, her eyes searching his for the lie she expected to find. "You told me you didn't have a conscience. You didn't say you were a hacker. You're telling me this because you want me to think someone else is the villain." "I am telling you this because the signature matches a frequency used by the Vane family," Jinwoo said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Victor Vane didn't want you to hit me, Tracy. He wanted me to kill you. He thought a tragic accident involving a commoner and my convoy would spark the very riots he needs to devalue the waterfront properties I'm buying. He didn't count on me being intrigued." Tracy stood up, her heart racing. "So the crash wasn't just a trap? It was a hit? You're telling me my life was just a pawn in a real estate war between two monsters?" "Every life is a pawn until it decides to move on its own," Jinwoo replied, his gaze unwavering. He reached past her, his hand brushing her shoulder as he pointed at the screen. "Look at the timestamp. The pulse was triggered at 8:14 a.m. Where were you exactly 30 seconds before that?" Tracy closed her eyes, visualizing the morning of the crash. She remembered the bus stop. She remembered the black van that had pulled out behind her, and she remembered the small, blinking light on her dashboard that she had ignored because she was too busy worrying about the center's utility bill. "I was at the intersection of 4th and Main." "Exactly. Victor's territory." Jinwoo stepped back, his expression returning to that of the cold, calculating boss. "He used you to get to me, and he used me to destroy you." But he made a mistake. He gave me exactly what I needed to justify removing him from the board.
Tracy felt a wave of nausea. She looked around the tech lab, at the posters made by the kids, the donated books, the sanctuary she had built, and realized that the walls were thinner than she had ever imagined. The gilded contract wasn't just a debt, it was a sanctuary. Jinwoo hadn't just bought her time, he had bought her life back from a man who had already marked her for death. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and realization. "Is this more transparency for your new conscience?" "I'm telling you because the veins aren't finished," Jinwoo said, stepping toward the door. "They saw how you handled the council. They saw how I looked at you at dinner. You aren't just a social worker anymore, Tracy. You are the only part of my empire that isn't armored. And tonight, that makes you the most dangerous place to be." He stopped at the threshold and looked back at her. "I've doubled the detail at your apartment. Don't leave the center without my lead driver. The ghost in the machine is gone, but the men who sent it are very much alive." As he walked away, the heavy thud of his dress shoes echoing in the quiet hallway, Tracy sat back down in her creaky chair. She looked at the screen, at the lines of data that proved her life had been manipulated by forces she couldn't see. She had thought she was saving her community by signing Jinwoo's contract, but she realized now that she was standing in the center of a much larger fire. She wasn't just a bridge, she was the battlefield. And as she looked at the black SUVs waiting outside in the twilight, she realized that the man who had destroyed her car might be the only thing standing between her and a ghost that finally wanted to finish the job. The following week, the Bendel Community Center underwent a transformation that felt more like a military occupation than a renovation. Men in silent, dark uniforms replaced the flickering fluorescent tubes with soft, recessed lighting that made the aging bricks glow like embers. New computers arrived in crates bearing no logos, and the industrial kitchen was stocked with high-grade provisions that the neighborhood hadn't seen in decades. But as the physical walls were reinforced, the tension between Tracy and her benefactor only grew. She found Jinwoo in the center's small courtyard late one evening, watching a group of neighborhood kids play on a brand-new reinforced playground set he had installed over the weekend. He looked out of place against the backdrop of graffiti-covered alleyways, yet he stood with a stillness that suggested he was anchored to the spot. Tracy approached him, her heels clicking on the new pavement. She didn't thank him. Instead, she stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You're trying to buy a conscience again, Jinwoo, but you can't just throw money at a neighborhood and expect the ghosts to stop screaming."
Jinwoo didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on a small boy struggling to reach the top of the climbing wall. "I am not buying anything, Tracy. I am balancing a ledger that has been in the red for a very long time." "Is that what this is? Penance?" she asked, her voice softening despite herself. "You spent 5 chapters of your life being the villain, and now you want to skip to the redemption arc?" Jinwoo finally turned to her. The sunset caught the amber flecks in his eyes, making him look less like the syndicate boss and more like a man haunted by a memory he couldn't outrun. "When I was 8 years old, my mother ran a center not unlike this one in Incheon. It was a place for the invisible people, the ones the economic miracle left behind. She believed that if you gave people a beautiful place to stand, they would eventually start to act like they deserved to be there." He paused, a muscle in his jaw twitching. The local gangs didn't agree. They wanted the land for a warehouse. They burned the center to the ground while she was inside, trying to save the records of the families she helped. They thought they were destroying her work. Instead, they just ensured that her son would grow up to own the very hands that lit the match. Tracy felt the air leave her lungs. The cold majesty she had attributed to him suddenly felt like a tomb he had built around himself to protect that 8-year-old boy. So you became the thing that killed her to make sure it never happens again? I became the thing that controls the fire, Jinwoo corrected, his voice a low, dangerous silk. But in the process, I forgot what the center looked like before it burned. I forgot why she bothered to save the records. Until I saw you standing in the rain, screaming at my convoy because you were more afraid of losing your center than you were of me. He stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and cold air enveloping her. You are not a PR strategy, Tracy. You are a reminder of a life I was supposed to have. I am obsessed with your goodness because it is the only thing in this city that isn't a transaction. You don't want my money. You want my change. And that is the most expensive thing I've ever been asked to give. Tracy looked at the children playing, then back at the man who destroyed her car to save her life. She realized then that his obsession with her wasn't predatory in the way she had feared. It was aspirational. He was a man who had mastered the darkness and found it hollow, reaching for her light as if it were the only true north he had ever known. But the weight of his past was a gravity that threatened to pull her down with him. You can't just build a playground and call it a day, Jinwoo, her voice trembling with a mix of empathy and warning. The families you're fighting, the Vanes, they don't care about your mother's memory. They see this center as a weakness. They see me as your weakness. I know, Jinwoo replied, his expression hardening back into the unreadable mask of the boss. That is why the charity ends tomorrow. We have been playing at being good for a week, but the Vanes have moved their assets to the waterfront.
They are preparing for a strike, Tracy. They think that by attacking what I love, they can force me to kneel. Tracy's heart skipped a beat at the word love, but Jinwoo was already moving toward the waiting SUV. The moment of vulnerability was over, replaced by the cold calculation of a man preparing for war. I'm moving you to a secure location tonight, he said, his hand on the car door. The center is protected, but you are the target now. You wanted to know why I'm obsessed with goodness. It's because in my world, goodness is the only thing worth dying for. As the convoy pulled away, Tracy stood alone in the courtyard she had fought so hard to save. She looked at the gleaming new equipment and the reinforced fences, realizing that her sanctuary had become a fortress, and she was the prize that two warring empires were about to tear the city apart to claim. Jinwoo wasn't just her benefactor anymore. He was her protector, her captor, and the only man who knew that her goodness was the most dangerous weapon in the world. The grand ballroom of the Obsidian Hotel was a palace of hollow light and predatory elegance. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears over a crowd of the city's elite, but the atmosphere was far from celebratory. This was the night of the final corporate acquisition, the moment Park Jin-woo would officially pivot from a syndicate boss to a legitimate titan of industry. To the world, it was a triumph. To Tracy, standing in a gown of midnight blue that felt like a shroud, it was a crime scene. She had spent the last 48 hours in a secure location, which was little more than a gold-leafed prison. In the silence of that isolation, she had finally pieced together the fragments of the truth. It wasn't just about the veins or the shipping yards. It was about the contract, the gold-embossed paper she had signed in a moment of desperation. She realized now that Jin-woo hadn't just wanted a conscience, he wanted a witness who could provide him with the ultimate alibi of morality while he devoured the city's infrastructure. As the music swelled, Jin-woo approached her. He looked magnificent, a king at the height of his powers, yet his eyes were restless. He reached for her hand, his touch possessive and cold. "Smile, Tracy,"
his breath warm against her ear. "In 10 minutes, I take the stage. You will stand beside me as I announce the new foundation. The press will see you, and the council will see their hero. The deal will be sealed." "The deal was sealed the moment you hacked my brakes, Jinwoo," Tracy replied, her voice low and sharp as a blade. She didn't pull away. She stayed close, her eyes locked on his. "I know about the logistics firms. I know they aren't just shipping yards. They are the same routes, the veins used for human trafficking. You aren't closing them down. You're just changing the management."
Jinwoo's grip tightened, his mask of calm fracturing for the briefest of seconds. "I am cleaning them up. I am doing what has to be done to ensure they can never be used by men like Victor again. You have to trust the process." "I don't trust the process of a man who builds a playground on top of a graveyard," she snapped. The master of ceremonies announced his name, and the room erupted in polite, measured applause. Jinwoo began to lead her toward the stage, his hand firm on the small of her back. This was the moment of total entrapment. If she stood there, silent and complicit, she would be his forever, the saint who sanctioned the devil. As they reached the podium, the bright lights of the press cameras blinded her. Jinwoo stepped to the microphone, his voice radiating a fabricated warmth. "Tonight is not about profit," he began, his hand finding hers. "It is about the soul of this city, and no one embodies that soul more than Tracy Bendel. Because of her, the Park Group is changing its path. We are—" "He's lying." The words weren't loud, but in the amplified silence of the ballroom, they hit like a physical blow. Tracy stepped forward, pulling her hand from his as if it had been burned. The camera flashes intensified, a chaotic storm of white light. "Tracy, don't!" Jinwoo hissed, his shadow looming over her. "The contract I signed was a debt for a car I never chose to hit," Tracy said, her voice echoing through the speakers, steady and defiant. She reached into her clutch and pulled out the folded cream-colored paper. "This document isn't a partnership. It's a ransom note. Mr. Park didn't find me. He manufactured a disaster to acquire me. And while he talks about foundations and community, he is currently finalizing the acquisition of firms that thrive on the misery of the very people I protect." The room descended into a frantic roar of whispers and gasps. Jinwoo stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and burgeoning rage. He had spent millions to build this stage, and she was burning it down in front of the entire world. "I am breaking this contract," Tracy declared, her eyes finding Jinwoo's. She didn't see the boss anymore. She saw the 8-year-old boy who was so afraid of the fire that he had decided to become the match. "You told me you were obsessed with my goodness, Jinwoo. Well, here it is. My goodness says that I cannot be your shield. I cannot be the face of a lie. If you want to be a better man, do it because it's right, not because you have a social worker to show off." She tore the paper in half. The sound of the heavy vellum ripping was the loudest thing in the room. She dropped the pieces at his feet and walked off the stage.
The shipping yards are being signed over to a community trust. The logistics firms are being audited by the city. I am liquidating the empire, Tracy. All of it. Tracy stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. "Why? Because I humiliated you at the gala?" "Because you were right," Jinwoo said, taking a step toward her. "I thought I could control the fire. I thought if I used the darkness to build something good, the darkness wouldn't count. But I watched you stand on that stage and risk everything just to tell the truth. You were willing to lose your center, your safety, and your future just to keep your soul." He looked at the crumbling brick of the center behind her. "I realized I'd rather be a man with nothing who is worthy of your respect than a king who has to trick you into staying." The air between them crackled with the weight of his choice. This was the burning of the convoy. He wasn't just giving up money. He was giving up his protection, his identity, and the only life he had ever known since the day his mother's center burned.
By liquidating Lotus, he was making himself a target for every rival he had ever stepped on, including the veins. He was choosing to be vulnerable. "You're going to be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life," Tracy whispered, her heart aching for the man behind the monster. "I've been looking over my shoulder since I was 8 years old," Jinwoo replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "At least now, when I look back, I won't see a trail of lies. I've cleared the debt, Tracy. The Bugatti, the contract, the center, it's all gone. There is no more leverage." He turned to walk back to his car, but Tracy called out his name. He stopped, his back to her, his shoulders tense. "Why are you really doing this? Is this just another move to get me to stay?" Jinwoo turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the streetlights. "I'm doing it so that if I ever ask you to stay again, it will be the first time in my life I've asked for something I didn't already own. I'm choosing to be better, Tracy. Not for you, but because you made me remember that I could be." He didn't wait for her to answer. He got into the car and drove away, leaving Tracy standing at the gate. As the taillights faded into the city night, she realized that the man who had crashed into her life to trap her had just destroyed everything he possessed to set her free. The debt was settled, but a new, far more complicated question remained. What happened to a saint when the devil finally decided to change? 6 months later, the Bendel Community Center didn't look like a fortress anymore, nor did it look like a ruin. The scaffolding had come down, revealing a structure that honored its history while embracing a future that was finally secure.
The park name was nowhere to be found on the building. Instead, a simple plaque near the entrance dedicated the new wing to the memory of a mother who had believed in the power of a beautiful place to stand. Tracy stood at the front desk, sorting through neighborhood flyers, when she heard the familiar low hum of an engine. Not the roar of a hypercar, but the steady, honest sound of a man arriving without a convoy. Jinwoo entered the lobby wearing a simple dark sweater and jeans. The cold majesty that had once defined him had softened into something more human, though the intensity in his eyes remained. He had spent the last several months in a legal and financial purgatory, untangling the knots of his former life. He was no longer a king, but he was finally a man who could walk down the street without looking for ghosts. "The training center is full," Tracy said, her voice warm but grounded. She didn't drop what she was doing. She didn't need to perform for him anymore. 3 of the mothers from the waterfront project just passed their certification. They start at the logistics firm on Monday, the one the city took over. Jinwoo leaned against the desk, watching her. "And the foreclosure?" "Settled. The community trust owns the land now. No one can ever take it away from us again." She finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "You kept your word, Jinwoo. You burned the empire and left us with the foundation." "I left myself with a foundation, too," he replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was a keychain, a simple, cheap plastic thing from a local gas station. "I bought a car yesterday, a used sedan. It has excellent brakes." Tracy felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, the first truly effortless sound she had made since the day of the collision. "Is that right? I hope you have better insurance this time." "I have something better than insurance," Jinwoo said, his expression turning serious. He stepped around the desk, stopping just close enough for her to feel the familiar electric pull of his presence. "I have a clean slate. I have a life that isn't a transaction, and I have the courage to ask you for something I don't own." The air in the lobby grew still. The kids in the gym were laughing. The radiators were humming with a new steady heat, and the scent of fresh paint and coffee filled the air. This was the world they had built together, one through desperation, the other through redemption. "I'm not the woman I was when I crashed into you. I'm not a victim, and I'm not a conscience for hire." "I know," Jinwoo replied, reaching out and gently taking her hand. His fingers were warm, his grip steady.
That's why I'm here. I don't want a shield, Tracy.
And I don't want a saint. I just want to know if there's room in this community for a man who is learning how to be good from the ground up. Tracy looked down at their joined hands. She thought of the Bugatti, the contract, the gala, and the fire. She thought of the man who had been a monster and the man who had dismantled his world to prove he could change. Redemption didn't happen in a single moment. It happened in the quiet, honest choices made after the wreckage was cleared. "We have a volunteer orientation tonight at 6, she said, a small, hopeful smile playing on her lips. "We need someone to help with the youth basketball league. It's hard work, the pay is non-existent, and the kids won't care who you used to be." Jinwoo smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and stayed there. "It sounds like exactly what I can afford." As the sun set over the neighborhood, casting a long golden light across the new pavement of the intersection, the two of them walked toward the gymnasium together. There were no SUVs waiting in the shadows, no contracts waiting to be signed. There was only the sound of a community breathing, the steady beat of a heart that had survived the crash, and the beginning of a story that was finally, truly their own. Sometimes a collision doesn't just destroy. Sometimes it breaks everything open so that something real can finally grow.